And I'm here today with Steve Bishop, who's the Senior Associate at the Casey Foundation, who oversees the work on probation and who's here to talk about the report, talk about that vision, and answer your questions. But before we dive in, I'd like to sort of give you a brief outline of how we want the next hour to go. Some of this will sound familiar because Beth shared it with you, but we'll start first. I'll be asking Steve a couple questions about the report and sort of just a little bit about the vision, so we're all kind of starting in the same place. And then we're going to turn to questions from you all, which you've already submitted on JDI Connect over the past couple of weeks, so thank you for those. And then from there, we'll be keeping an eye out throughout this session for questions that you submit in the chat box. So again, please send your questions in as we're talking. If anything comes to mind, we'd love to hear them and to answer them. And again, you can do that by using the chat feature. Just hover over the navigation at the bottom of the Zoom window, and you should see chat there if the box isn't already open. So our goal is to get through as many questions as we can over the next hour. So like I said, keep them coming, and please don't be shy about challenging us, about really pushing us on any of these things. We think this is a conversation that's long overdue and certainly a challenging one to have, but it's one we very much want to have, and we want to grapple through these issues with you. One more thing here. So I'm going to, as a reminder, we are recording this, and it will be posted later this afternoon on JDI Connect. And so now I'm going to just briefly introduce Steve, who I think probably needs no introduction. I have a feeling many of you saw Steve last month during the webinar when we launched the report. But Steve has worked in juvenile justice for over 2 decades, and he began his career as a juvenile probation officer in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And that experience definitely has shaped his view of probation and sort of his thoughts about ways that we can make it better. And he's going to talk more about that in a little bit. And he went on to work at the Pennsylvania Juvenile Court Judges Commission, where he was for over a decade before coming to Casey in 2015. So speaking as someone, I'll just say personally, as someone who's heard Steve talk about probation quite a bit over the last year, I have to say that passion probably doesn't come close to describing how deeply he cares about this issue and how committed he is to transforming the way we approach probation throughout the country. And so with that, Steve, let's get started.
Okay.
So just to start, so Steve, as I said, it's been a little over a month since the foundation released the report. And, I think since then, obviously we've been hearing from people, getting their reactions, and it seems like some folks are, a little bit offended at the way we talk about probation in the report, and even maybe feel like there's a little bit of an attack on probation officers. And so, what's your reaction to that? And what are your thoughts about people's feelings?
Yeah, good question. So first, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon and taking time out of your busy schedules. So yeah, I'm glad you went there. It's the first question. The reality is that I'm a probation guy. As you said, I started my career as a probation officer. Even though it's been a long time since I've actually had a caseload, that's still how I identify as a probation officer. Those experiences I had early on with young people, with their families, I still remember names, I remember specific circumstances and instances. So I think most in the field can relate to that. That's just something that always kind of sticks with you. So in terms of how we talked about probation, what I would encourage folks to do is just to make sure that they're reading deeper into the report and then ask themselves the question, do you feel like we're taking on, and if we're attacking at all, are we attacking the people, the probation officers, or the structure for probation? And I think that what folks will find is that what we're really taking aim at is the latter, which is the structure of probation. My experience as a probation officer was I had a lot of kids on my caseload who didn't really need probation, and I tried hard to not pull them deeper into the system. I had a smaller group of kids on my caseload that I just couldn't spend enough time and give enough attention to, didn't have enough resources. And even over my career since being a probation officer and a supervisor, doing technical assistance all over the country, what I hear consistently from probation officers is the struggles with engaging families, with community partners, having enough resources, enough positive things for kids that are on their caseloads to do. And so what we're really talking about in the report, and if we're attacking anything, and when we talk about it being flawed in concept and execution, we say that without apology. The basic core of probation, which is a judge putting a kid on probation, a long list of rules for a teenager to remember, to expect nearly perfect compliance, and largely being pretty deficit-based, looking at fixing deficits, addressing clinical needs, not as much attention to their strengths and, just basic developmental assets. Those are structural issues. And again, my experience in probation was for the kids that I wanted to go the extra mile for, it was difficult. It was difficult to access resources. It was difficult to tap into the funding that we needed, or sometimes the right community connections and county contracts weren't in place. It oftentimes for individual probation officers is very challenging to go the extra mile. So what we're taking aim at in the paper is the structure of probation, because it shouldn't be that challenging to go the extra mile. That should really be the norm. And the other piece in terms of saying that probation is, flawed in concept and execution, again, it's quite simply that structure of putting kids on probation, a long list of rules and conditions, just doesn't align with what we know about adolescent development. I don't think if any of us were asked to colonize some planet or some other place and say, you're going to start youth justice, knowing everything we know, what we would not come up with is give a teenager a long list of rules to remember and expect perfect compliance and then sanction them when, surprisingly, they have some missteps and some setbacks through their adolescence. And so I think unapologetically we say that, but also what we're trying to do and what we're trying to propose is a structure that I think better positions very well-intentioned people, probation officers who work hard, who stepped into the field probably envisioning themselves doing something very different than what they're asked to do on a day-to-day basis. So what I'm trying to do as a probation person who still has a love for the profession and sees myself that way is try to propose some recommendations that I think set the structure to really allow probation officers to utilize their skills and their training and do the work that they came into the field wanting to do.
Let's talk a little bit more about that structure.
Mm-hmm.
So, you really touched on how probation as it exists right now can be ineffective and not really achieve the goal in terms of making sure young people get back on track, right?
Yeah.
And don't end up in the system or further in the system. So, let's talk a little bit about what would the ideal be? What would we replace what we currently do with, and what would that look like?
So we throw a couple of words around that I think probably raises some tentacles for folks. When we talk about those specifically, we talk about probation being ineffective, and that's just a scan of the research. That at its core, most criminal juvenile justice programs measure themselves based on reducing recidivism, reducing reoffending, and consistently probation, surveillance-oriented probation, again, that basic concept of put a kid on probation, you have rules to follow, and you have a PO who keeps tabs on that, doesn't reduce reoffending. It has very little effect on reducing reoffending. There are other programs, services, and approaches that when added with probation can have an impact, but the basic structure of probation just simply doesn't have an impact. So, based on the research, it's ineffective. The reason we say it's outdated goes back to my earlier point about none of us would imagine that is the appropriate way to deal with youth behaviors, the basic structure of probation. And so it's just outdated. The idea of having long list of rules for adolescents to remember is outdated. The idea of being mostly deficit focused, and while treating clinical needs is important, being overly focused on that and not attending to basic developmental needs, making sure kids have safe recreational spaces, constructive activities to engage in, positive role models and mentors to connect to. Those are the type of things we want for all of our kids. And so the basic structure just really does not align with all of the knowledge that we now have and accumulated, especially over the last 10, 15, 20 years, about what works with both delinquent and overall the way that teenagers are wired, and how do we help them be productive.
So if not
and so what will we do? Incentives has to be a big piece of that. Well, let me back up. So reducing the number of rules we ask young people to remember would be one thing. I think about myself. I'm father of teenage boys, and on a typical Saturday morning in the Bishop household, I can give my kids a whole list of to-dos, and within an hour I go back and they're sitting down and I'm like, what happened to all the things I told you? And it's like they're trying to remember. So first of all, giving kids these long laundry lists of things that they shouldn't do is just not effective. We should be utilizing incentives much more. We know that giving kids opportunities, more immediate rewards, so that they can achieve success, feel like they've been successful, acknowledge when they are following the rules and complying. It's important to do that early and often, and also use that incentives and reward structure to connect kids to positive youth development opportunities, connect them to positive adults and activities that are meaningful to young people. And again, same as we do, as parents do all the time, whether it's a teenager having the privilege to drive the car and get their license, or the pair of sneakers that they want, or the latest gaming system. This is something that it's not new. It may be new to juvenile justice, the idea of incentives, but rewarding our kids and giving them motivators to achieve results, it's not new.
So just want to actually follow up on that for just a minute here. So, I listened to that, and I think, again, feedback we've gotten from folks about incentives. I mean, let's keep in mind here, these are not totally innocent kids, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they've done something wrong. And so are we coddling kids by using incentives?
I wouldn't say coddle, but the word I would use is nurture. And we should be nurturing young people. And again, keeping in mind that these, especially if we are maximizing opportunities for diversion, and we'll talk about that some, if we're thinking about probation being for young people who have committed serious and repeat offenses. Again, yes, these are young people who have caused harm to their community, who have put their own families through all sorts of trials and tribulations, and have victims who have harmed people. But if we are really going to have a belief and a hope that, and the whole foundation of the juvenile justice system is the idea that these are young people, that they can be rehabilitated, and that they can make good and be productive members of society, then we have an obligation to nurture them. So we're going to call it coddling or nurturing. We have an obligation to both nurture their development, to help them learn to make better decisions, to have some empathy for the victims, for their families, for their communities who they cause damage to, but to also give them some hope. And part of building that hope is goal setting with them and giving them some rewards that they can easily attain and achieve as part of going through this process of change.
So we've got sort of one core here, this idea of having a more nurturing role, right? Probation serving in that way, as opposed to currently sort of more surveillance and punishment that are carried. And so what's sort of the other, when you envision this change structure for probation, is there some other core aspect that you're advancing that we think that we should be doing?
So the first part, and this has been really what's been important for everyone to understand when we talk about probation transformation. Of course, we talk about kind of two pillars to our vision, and one is about expanding significantly the utilization of diversion and really being clear about what we mean by diversion, but then also limiting and targeting probation against young people with serious and repeat offenses. The reason we've given so much attention to diversion in the probation paper, though, is because even in our best efforts, imagining a system of probation that's going to be truly effective, it's hard to conceive if you have the wrong population. And so part of what we've learned, both through research and what we know about adolescent development, is that most young people engage in some form of delinquency or problem behaviors, and almost everyone ages out of those behaviors with or without juvenile justice intervention. So there's huge opportunities to utilize diversion, which does actually produce really great outcomes for the appropriate youth that nationally we're just not utilizing. The rates of utilization for diversion and probation have not even really changed over the last 20 years. And this is as we've learned so much, again, about what types of programs and services actually reduce delinquency, what the right target population is. We see great results on diversion programs, and utilization hasn't really changed. So the first piece is really that, utilize diversion more, and then refashioning probation in a way, how I started off talking about, which is to make it targeted so that every young person who's on probation, their probation officer has an opportunity to form a close parent relationship with them, so that the structure is in place to be able to access the right community resources and opportunities to really help young people not just stop reoffending, but also to get on a path for a successful adulthood.
So let's take a minute to talk about race and probation.
Yes.
This is another thing that we talk about quite a bit in this report, and that is highlighted as being key for systems to focus on, even as they're in this transformation process. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about why that's so important, what the data tell us that makes this so key, and why you think it's important that systems are leading with that explicitly, as opposed to just kind of working on transformation and then hoping that that works out.
Quite simply, and we talked about this in the report, because race is the elephant in the room. Race permeates every aspect of not only our juvenile justice system, but our criminal justice system. And we see those disparities at every point of contact, from arrest and the way that policing patterns, deployment patterns, the experiences that young people have with police is largely dependent upon their race, ethnicity, the neighborhood they live in, the school that they go to. That's just a fact. It's not one that I don't think anyone would even dispute. And so we see disparities at arrest, we see disparities in diversion. Youth of color have fewer opportunities for diversion than their white counterparts. Youth of color are overly represented on probation as opposed to their representation in the population. And the deeper you go into the system, the worse it gets. So in 2015, more than 2/3 of young people in residential custody for violating probation are youth of color. Today, youth of color are actually more likely to be confined than they were 20 years ago. And this is even as we've seen a lot of improvement in terms of the use of secure detention has gone down, the use of incarceration and out-of-home placement has gone down. So we've seen advances, but yet the disparities have actually gotten worse. And so quite frankly, any further improvement we're going to do as a system, while we can often be reluctant to address race because it is a very tricky issue and it's uncomfortable, and it's the elephant in the room. All roads towards further system improvement really have to go through that conversation about racial equity, and we have to put it front and center, because no matter what jurisdiction you're in, and this can be large urban areas where you have lots of youth of color, and it can be smaller rural jurisdictions with not many youth of color. Overall, facilities, detention facilities, probation roles are filled up with youth of color. And so we just have to be real about that. And I also think it's important to acknowledge it as a system because we understand about procedural fairness and justice. And the idea of fairness is so central and key to adolescence. The idea of teenagers say it all the time, that's not fair. And whether it's fair or not, that perception is really powerful. So particularly youth of color who know, who they live that experience every day in terms of the way their schools, their neighborhoods, their police, their interactions that they have. It's quite frankly disingenuous to not be explicit about race and take that head on, both within probation departments and within juvenile courts, but particularly within our interactions with families and communities.
Actually, so I am going to turn to the questions from the community, but actually, since you brought that up,
Sure.
I wanted to just quickly ask you, you mentioned families and communities a couple of times. You mentioned earlier how important they are to this, and then just again now. Can you just talk briefly about why it's so important for families and communities to be engaged in sort of this conversation about transforming probation and the actual process of changing things in the system?
Again, it's developmental. And again, it's just really thinking about the structure of our systems and trying to prioritize the things that are most important. And that it's not a big revelation that if you're talking about youth justice and if you're talking about adolescents, that their families and their communities have to be a part of that mix. Even the most impactful, effective probation officer, and I like to think that I had such an impact on every single kid that I ever was involved with, but even the most effective probation officer, that's a short-term relationship. The people who are going to have the most impact on a young person for the long term are people in their families and that family network, that support, that circle of support, and people in their communities. And so if we really want to think about long-term success for young people, it's just important that we shuffle the deck some to make sure that we're prioritizing those relationships. And again, hear it all the time for probation officers about the struggles sometimes with engaging families. And it's not because folks are not well-intentioned, but the way the system is structured, the way that the court process operates, the way normal day-to-day probation practices function does not put family engagement as a priority. And what we're suggesting is that it just has to be, and it's difficult. It is. It's extremely difficult. It can be challenging, but we just have to keep pouring resources into getting better at that if we want to get the best outcomes with young people. And the same thing with communities. We know a lot of the kids who come into contact with the system are in communities that are underserved and under-resourced. And we know that sometimes the gaps for them are not having positive role models and mentors or, community centers to go to and constructive activities to be engaged in. And that's for all people, all the kids sometimes in those neighborhoods. So particularly for the kids in the system who have the most challenges and the most needs, and the kids we can least afford to screw it up with, it's so important that we invest the time and energy and the resources into building up those areas. So again, overall, this isn't about the people doing the practice. This is about the structure and trying to re-engineer the structure of probation practices so that we're putting more time and effort and money into building up those community resources and those community partnerships, and into making sure we understand the needs of families and have the voice of families included in everything that we do. And the last point I'll just say on that is the other thing, and this, with the research tells us and what my own experience says as well, again, even the most skillful probation officer, is that we can't do it alone. I mean, we need to shift our mindset about that, about thinking that the impact of even the best judges out there, the best probation officers out there, is going to have the type of long-term effect that we want to have with young people. We just simply can't do it alone. We shouldn't want to do it alone.
Thank you for that. So we're going to turn now to the questions that we got through the JDI community over the past couple of weeks. Thanks again for those. So Steve, we're going to start with a couple questions from Annie Sosek. So her question is, how do we best go about sharing this report and fostering conversations about the report with probation staff? And also, what's the role of supervisors in allowing space for those and facilitating those types of conversations?
So that's a great question about how to share it out, because understanding that as much pride as we have in our lovely report, that everyone doesn't necessarily have the time to pick it up and read it right away, and particularly probation officers. So that's a great question. I think it's important for probation leaders, probation chiefs, deputy chiefs, supervisors to find the time to read it as much as they can, and then just break it out in chunks. Take a look at a survey of your own department and your data, and figure out and start to take a look at what you're good at and where you maybe have some challenges. Do you have too many kids who've been assessed as low risk on probation? What's the ratio of that? So could you do better in building up your diversion opportunities for young people and making that experience something different, and starting to farm that out to community organizations as we suggest? What is the percentage of placement, out-of-home placements that are the result of violations of probation? Taking a look at that, taking a scan of the number of community partnerships and resources that you've developed, taking a look at your policies around family engagement. But to really break it out in chunks, we described on the front end of the report a number of practices that we suggest are counterproductive and don't align with what we know about adolescent development. And that's a good place to start, to kind of see where you measure up with that and have conversations. Probation leaders, probation chiefs are very effective. As a former probation supervisor, I have a soft spot for that, because supervisors are in the unique position of both understanding at an administrative level the direction that the department's going, but they're also kind of hands-on the day-to-day, doing the coaching and everything else with probation staff. So I think, like in unit meetings, as probation supervisors do unit meetings, those are great opportunities to take small pieces and just have discussions about it. What would it mean to do incentives? Okay, how much do you use incentives in your case management? What support do you need from the department to do that? And start to foster those conversations, but not to try to digest it all at once, but to really break it out in chunks in some of the areas, in the natural areas that we've laid out in the paper.
No expectation that everybody do it all at once. And I just saw a note here about we need to try and speak up. So we'll work on that. For those of you who can't hear us, sorry, I usually don't get that criticism. So the next question is from Sheila in Pima County. And she says, I'm very interested in thoughts and ideas around including credible messengers in our work. This is something we're exploring in Pima County, and what's clear is that there are still systemic barriers that need to be removed. How can including credible messengers be embedded in the work?
So I think it can be embedded in a couple different ways. The idea of credible messengers, I just think is extremely important because, again, what makes connections and what's going to help move young people along is knowing that they have someone who understands their circumstances. And so oftentimes utilizing a credible messenger really speaks to that. And that could be adults who've been through the system themselves, or maybe not, just from the same neighborhood as young people, but they understand the challenges that they face day to day and know how to kind of navigate some of the same situations. And so I think finding opportunities, and there's a lot of different programs that are out there that utilize advocates and mentors and things like that, that I know probation departments contract with, but just increasing the utilization of that, thinking how you can use them more creatively, thinking of how you can further fund those types of programs so that they can expand their program services to include providing kids opportunities and incentives, taking them on field trips and things like that, I think are important. There are systemic barriers that are in place. I mean, we talk about working in juvenile justice or even having contracts with juvenile courts. Typically, having any type of criminal record would, make someone ineligible. That's just something we need to rethink because I think there's an untapped workforce. I think on both sides of the aisle, folks have recognized some of the missteps that have led to mass incarceration. And as a lot of those folks are reentering the community, you have a workforce of people who are eager to give back to their communities, who are eager to help young people who are now walking in the steps that they walked in several years before, and can be really effective in reaching those young people and keeping them on the right path. So there are systemic barriers. Don't have a quick fix for that, but I think we could find solutions and be creative to both be responsible in terms of folks who come with criminal records and have to work with young people, but also making sure we're not missing out on a really valuable resource.
Well, as I recall, there are also some organizations that specialize in sort of this credible messenger piece specifically. So when you talked earlier about engaging community partners,
Yeah.
there's some ways, it seems like, around some of these barriers from maybe you're not engaging these folks directly, but you're working with community partners who might be able to bring that resource to the table. Does that seem like an option? Yeah.
And I mean, and again, I think there's lots of organizations out there in various communities that do that. I mean, there's credible messengers, and out of New York, there's Youth Advocate Program that has a national footprint. So there definitely are organizations like that pride themselves on both working with young people, having a positive youth development approach, and also wanting to recruit and retain staff that are from the communities where a lot of the court-involved youth are from.
Thank you. So our next question is from Curtis in Summit County, Ohio, who I know is tuned in today. Curtis wanted some suggestions on amending probation rules and the transformation process. You said that they're considering amending a standard rule, which is to, quote, obey all city, county, state, and federal laws and ordinances and notify your probation officer if you're arrested, detained, or questioned by law enforcement. So he wanted to know if there are any other items of standard probation rules that should be addressed in the transformation process. And I know we've talked some about that, but if there's anything else that comes to mind or any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Curtis. Thanks for that question, and glad to hear that in Summit you're reconsidering some of these rules, and I think you're on the right path in terms of what you're considering, because this standard rule, and that's in probably almost every juvenile court order across the nation about you must comply with all state, county, and federal laws, is an example of, I think, where we just need to be more discerning. We only get so many bites at the apple with young people, and again, long laundry list of rules. They're just not likely to remember. We can give them a piece of paper and tell them stick it on their refrigerator or anywhere else. And again, anyone who remembers your days as an adolescent or has teenagers that you're raising knows that that's not a really good approach. You're not going to get the most effect there. So I just think you have to really be discerning about what are the rules, that maybe handful of rules, 4 or 5 rules that are most important. And you don't really need to tell kids, don't break the law. Everyone knows that. You can say that. And there's going to be naturally occurring consequences. And so all the time we see court orders that are loaded up with rules that, again, have some naturally occurring consequences. And it's important that young people be held accountable. but that doesn't necessarily then need to result in a violation of probation. And that's unfortunately what often happens, is that the types of rules that are put in place, which are well-meaning and they're good rules, telling kids to be in school every day, telling them don't hang with negative peers, telling them, don't break any laws, don't use any drugs and alcohol. All these are important things, but to double down on the natural occurring consequences. If you miss school, you skip school, there's going to be some type of infraction with the school. And again, it's important to hold young people accountable, have conversations with it, problem solve, help them, do better. But what often happens is those violations start to accrue, and then kids are back in court and they're pulled deeper into the system for behavior this normative behavior for adolescents, getting in trouble in school from time to time, missing curfew, forgetting to show up for appointments, not being where you're supposed to be. It's teenage behavior, not delinquent behavior.
So, the other thing I wanted to ask you is sort of one more question from the JDI Connect community is just, Rachel from Lucas County wanted to hear more about diversion.
Okay.
So, again, you've talked a lot about that. Wondering if you could maybe even go a little bit more into sort of how do we decide who qualifies for diversion?
Yeah.
You say use it more. How do we decide who's eligible for that? And even how do we deal with that? What you just said, the fact that there will be kids who don't comply. Even when you have a diversion, you have an agreement, they still may not follow the rules. And what do we do then?
Yeah. So a couple things to say about diversion, and thanks for that prompt, Rachel, and for the question about diversion. So a couple things to think about. One, again, we know that most young people will engage in all sorts of behavior and age out of it with or without intervention. So one of the things we probably underutilize, especially within diversion, is just the idea of warn, counsel, and close, like to give a warning for very minor first-time offenses and send kids on their way. And so part of that is coming to a recognition and reshaping our thinking about the role, again, of families and communities and schools. That I believe that most delinquent behaviors can be best handled and that youth can be appropriately held accountable and learn to grow from those experiences, but that families, communities, schools should be the front line of that, not the juvenile courts. And then we preserve resources. And so one of the ways we want to approach that, and the other piece is that we know that, again, there's vast disparities, that young people of color typically get fewer opportunities for diversion, and largely because it can be subjective in a lot of ways. And we start to take a look at what are the needs of young people, et cetera, and then that pushes them further into the system instead of thinking about how those needs can get met outside of the system. So a couple of things we want to take a look at in our recommendations around diversion. One, be very clear about the criteria and suggesting that misdemeanor offenses should be diverted, or a misdemeanor felony structure, however you would figure out what low-level offenses are in your jurisdiction. But that misdemeanor offenses, nonviolent felony offenses, first-time nonviolent felony offenses, those are appropriate cases for diversion. But to draw some kind of bright red lines with that to make sure that there's no disparities happening, that all young people with certain classes of offenses have the opportunity for diversion. And then the other piece, again, is that it should be community-led, that families, community, schools should be much more on the front line of that without always kind of having the juvenile court as the boogeyman with the threat of court consequences for when young people don't comply. So shifting out that function out to communities in general or overall. And a big reason for that, again, is when we talk about the use of probation in this report, and right now about almost 2/3 of all adjudicated youth are put on probation, but there are actually even more young people who are supervised on informal probation caseloads than adjudicated youth on probation caseloads. And so what we have all across the nation, I know, which are young people who could be diverted, and they're being supervised by probation officers. And despite best intentions with policies and practices to say, don't over-intervene with these young people, the experience for those young people has all the look and feel of probation. They have a probation officer checking on them in school, at home, and other places in the community. There's contact requirements. You have to make appointments. You get random drug and alcohol testing. And most importantly for young people, and understanding the impact it has on them, they don't know I'm on informal probation. They don't know I got deferred adjudication or any of these euphemisms. What kids talk about is I have a PO. And so we have all of these young people who have not been found guilty in juvenile court, who have probation officers, and that has a profound impact on their long-term success as well. We know that. The research tells us that. So then the last part of it is, what do you do with kids when they don't comply with diversion agreements? And again, the rationale is most kids are going to age out of these behaviors anyway. So then we just really have to be measured and figure out, is the juice worth the squeeze? And I would say that in general, it's not. That kids are going to age out of these behaviors anyway. It makes more sense and it does less harm to be willing to just simply close some cases unsuccessful without pulling them deeper into the system.
Well, and to your point about the informal probation, I mean, in some ways that's also probably increasing caseloads, right, for the probation officer, right? Just even again, though it's not the adjudicated, kids, it's still another kid on my.
Yes, it's another kid on your caseload that you need to see. And again, and I speak from the personal experience, which is when you have those young people on your caseload that don't really need your attention, you still tend to see them because you're drawn towards them, because these are the young people who maybe have the right supports in place. They're very involved in community activities and in school activities, and they're on a little bit different trajectory. It may not be as challenging, and they tend to make you feel so good as a probation officer. So you just want to see them all the time, and it feels like this is why I got into this work. But I'm here to talk, like, that's not why you're here. That's not the job. The job is much tougher than that. And if it feels like an easy case on probation, they don't need probation. And you're right, no, that just takes resources and time away from probation officers.
So we've actually, it looks like we've gotten some questions in during the course of the town hall. So we're going to turn over to those now. Thank you guys, and keep them coming. We're ready. We're here. All right. So just to start. Okay. So here's a question we have. If the probation term is to go to school and the kid misses a bunch of days, what then? So it's kind of going along with this question about what do we do when kids don't do what they're supposed to do? Or if the kid constantly violates his curfew, what then? If you can never lock them up and they continue to be non-compliant, won't they think probation's a joke? And what should the consequences be?
So a couple of things with that. I want to break that out into two pieces. So it's a great question, and something I know that folks are going to struggle with. So let's take the first piece about school. School is extremely important. There's a reason that school attendance is mandatory for kids in this country, and there is definitely a connection between truancy and potential delinquent behavior. But first and foremost, it is a school issue. That doesn't mean that then there isn't a role in terms of collaborating with the schools and how to work for truancy. But I stand firm on the belief that that's not a juvenile court issue. That is a school issue. And when we use the juvenile court as the backstop for kids who have school issues, for kids who have undiagnosed or untreated mental health issues, for young people who come to our attention because they're embroiled in family crisis and there's domestic violence issues. When the juvenile courts are the backstop for that, what we have are kids who get pulled deeper into the system, into a criminal system, without having their other needs necessarily met. And it pulls those resources away from probation officers to work with you who have many more challenges and needs. So that would be an example of where the schools or other human service agencies are better suited to deal with that. On the curfew end of it, and again, remember my days as a probation officer, I completely get it. It is frustrating when kids aren't where they're supposed to be. When you tell a young person, I'm going to come out to your house tonight, be there at 6 o'clock, and they're not there. When you know that they're violating curfew night after night, when they miss appointments, it's extremely frustrating. But a couple of things to keep in mind, which is while it's frustrating and it's problematic and we should hold young people accountable in appropriate measured ways, we have to be careful that we don't do more harm than good. And we know that every day in care counts and has a potential harmful impact. So whether it's putting a kid in detention for a day or two or a weekend because of breaking probation rules, and certainly long-term out-of-home placement, we are running the risk of doing more harm than good. The other really important piece is that those type of typical behaviors, missing curfew, missing appointments, things of that nature have no correlation to subsequent offending. So even if a kid is just driving you crazy and never in the house when they're supposed to be, it tells us nothing about their potential for subsequent offending. And so again, to pull them deeper into the system and potentially do harm or long-term confinement is just, it's counterproductive. And the last piece I would say, again, from the perspective of a parent who deals with this all the time, fresh out from Monday morning with 2 teenagers at home, so you can imagine how weekends are. I can't think for the life of me how many rules my kids would break for me to get to the point and decide it's time for you to go. And I think most parents feel that way. And so we have to ask ourselves sometimes those like just really key questions about what are we trying to do here, and like how do we get the most results. And again, if we're talking about curfew, yes, it's frustrating. Yes, we want kids in when they're supposed to be. And yes, the breaking curfew may mean they're involved in things that could be even more problematic. But if we know that kids get better outcomes when they're in the community as opposed to an out-of-home placement, we just have to keep at it, and we have to be more resourceful. And we have to think about new ways of motivating them, using incentives, using opportunities, using little carrots, field trips, and other types of things to try to get them to comply. But locking them up just doesn't get us the results that we want.
Well, I mean, again, this needs to tie into what you were saying earlier about how the system can't do it alone, right? So
yeah.
And also it sounds to me, as you said, with the school system being involved with truancy cases, it's also a question, not so much of not doing something, but about which system should be doing something, right? And this idea that maybe it's not the juvenile probation part that needs to play that role, but that there are others who can step in and be.
Absolutely.
So we have more questions. One was actually just about, so under a JDI system, what behavior, and we talked a little bit about this around diversion, what behavior would a probation officer file a violation on, and can you give examples? So I guess a little bit ongoing conversation about when somebody misbehaves.
Yeah. So I don't have a special recipe for when you file a violation per se. And when I say file a violation, I'm talking about actually, whatever your jurisdiction, how it looks, doing some type of motion where it comes back to court. So I don't have a special recipe for that. What I would encourage jurisdictions to do is to have administrative procedures in place. Well, a couple different things. One, to have some type of system of graduated responses so that young people know what the rules are. They know when there's infractions of those rules, that the consequences are predictable and they know exactly what to expect. And making sure that those are measured. So having some system of graduated responses that is heavy with incentives, I think is important. Also having administrative review processes in place. So this could be as simple as a kid is violating a lot and scheduling some type of informal meeting where you bring in the child, their family, or other caretakers, and having a meeting with the probation officer, supervisor. It could be other high-level folks within a probation department, but have some type of administrative review process even before you would think about going to court. And again, if violations continue, I don't have a special mix for when that should go back to court, but what we're clear on, again, is thinking about is the juice worth the squeeze. What that violation shouldn't result in. Again, we're talking about violations, talking about not new offenses that will have some naturally occurring consequences. You commit new offenses, then you need to do some reassessment and make determinations about public safety risk and all that. But just breaking probation rules should never result in secure detention or out-of-home placement. And this isn't a Casey thing that we're saying. This isn't a JDI thing. Last year, the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges passed a resolution saying that jurisdictions should cease doing that. They should find alternatives to responses for violations of probation for all of those reasons, because we know there's disparities in placement decisions. We know that even the way we look at violations can be subjective, and most importantly, that these probation rule-breaking behaviors do not tell us about who's likely to reoffend. There's just no correlation between that and subsequent offending patterns.
And out of curiosity, so for that ruling, I mean, do you have any sense of how much folks are sort of responding to that? Do they tend to take notice when the national?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's still a little bit early. That was last year, and it was a resolution passed by the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges. I think it's significant though, because again, these are judges, And I've actually had the pleasure of, having some consultative sessions with some of the judges from that body as well. And my take on it, what I hear from judges is that oftentimes when probation officers come to court for violations, they feel they want to have the back of the probation officers. But they would also be pretty comfortable if there were other methods and processes in place to deal with violations where they didn't need to intervene as well. And so I think that resolution is reflective of the attitude that we can find other alternatives, and we should find other alternatives. Part of what I believe should be the purpose of probation, and one of the results that probation should be held accountable for, is keeping kids in the community. Again, we know that overwhelmingly young people who remain in the community have better outcomes than kids who go to out-of-home care. So that has to be a key responsibility and a key charge for probation. Is part of our job is to keep these kids in the community. It can't just be, an either or proposition. Well, they didn't follow the rules and they bombed out on probation, so now we go to placement. That's a failure. That's a system failure. And unfortunately, sometimes it comes to that because kids, commit very serious offenses, or in a really bad cycle, and they present significant risk to public safety. And so unfortunately, that's going to be reality sometime, but we have to take, measure every single case and know what the likely outcome is. And it's not usually a bright outcome when kids have to go to out-of-home placement. So doing that for breaking probation rules just seems really counterproductive.
Thank you. So we have more questions, and again, I encourage folks, please keep sending them in. We'll be here for another 12 minutes or so. There's another question here. We have more use on informal supervision than formal supervision. We also have pure diversion. For the most part, they'll close informal cases if unsuccessful or opposed to filing. However, if a youth owes restitution to a victim and still needs to repair that harm, how do you get around not filing?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. So first part is, yes, thanks for acknowledging that about the more youth on informal supervision than informal. On the probation side, obviously, what I would say is you can free up a lot of resources for your probation officers if you get kids off informal supervision. The restitution part of it is extremely important. And I'm not suggesting that you close those cases right away as unsuccessful. Repairing harm to victims is extremely important. It's important to the victims to make them whole, and it's important for the young people to be held accountable when they do damage. But I think juvenile courts also can take a look at what are the creative ways that they can make sure that young people repair the harm that they've done, that may not include direct payment. So for instance, there may be opportunities for juvenile courts to pool resources and have like restitution funds, where young people of certain ages who maybe aren't at an age to get a job, or having trouble getting a job, can do community service or do other things where they can earn money in lieu of having a job, and still that money can be repaid to a victim. I think using other types of teaming processes are helpful with that. My experience as a probation officer in Pennsylvania, we did a lot of family group decision making. And what was powerful about that type of teaming process was oftentimes you were able to tap into resources you didn't know existed. So tapping into community partners or community business leaders who maybe can offer employment to young people, or family members who can help you think creatively about how you can help them earn money to pay off restitution, and doing things like that. So that you don't necessarily, again, have to use the threat. If a young person isn't getting a job, all kids like money in their pocket. They're not getting a job, it's not because they don't want to pay restitution. If they could earn money to get a job, they would get a job. Refiling and taking them back to court isn't going to magically make them, get a job. So we just have to, again, I think, tap into all resources, have kind of an all hands on deck approach in terms of families, their circle of care, people in the community, to see how we can come up with some creative solutions. But yes, again, great question. That it's important that young people, make victims whole and that they pay back their obligations. I just think that we can be more creative in the opportunities we provide for them to do that.
Well, speaking of resources, this is a question we had a little bit earlier, was whether or not you could talk about ways to take advantage of resources that are already in systems, right, or that are in the community around reliable transportation, staff, etc. Where could folks be doing a better job of taking what we do to our youth in the community and not expecting them to come to us?
So the question is about.
So how could they better use those resources, I think, and how could they be better about engaging those resources as opposed to waiting for those folks to be coming to them?
Well, I think it's just that you have to be proactive about it, and I think it means having some folks that are dedicated to making it happen, having staff. And what we've seen nationally is that probation caseloads are decreasing because we've had juvenile crime going down. We have, detention, arrest rates, everything on the downswing. And what we've also seen is caseloads going down. So there may be opportunities, staffing opportunities to dedicate some probation staff to being a community liaison or something of that sort. That, you have people that are out there and tapping into those resources, talking to community partners, talking to people who run community-based organizations, the nonprofits, and finding out, what they have to offer, what types of services, how can they engage in some type of partnerships. But it takes being proactive and really getting out there and doing it, and also expanding the purview beyond the traditional partnerships and folks who have contracts with the court, and finding out, what are the churches that have a basketball court or something in their basement, or they do activities, but young people and people in the communities just don't know about it. What are kind of the mom and pop shops that are out there that have some services to offer? Who are the people who really know the community best, but again, don't have the formal contracts with the juvenile court? But it just takes being proactive. And I don't presume to have any idea about what are those resources in individual jurisdictions. And I'm sure that even out there in the juvenile court, there's plenty of probation officers who are in the streets every day, seeing young people on their caseloads and families, and they know all sorts of resources, again, that don't have the county contract, so they're not able to tap into those. So it just means, again, reinvesting, just prioritizing our focus. And if we know, and hear people talk about this all the time when I'm in probation departments about the lack of resources, if we have more things for kids to do in the community. So if we know that that's important, if we know for long-term success, if we could just get this kid connected to mentors, and role models, and in positive activities, and as a juvenile justice system, we should make that a focus.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we have apparently 10 employees from a county in Louisiana I will not even pretend to pronounce. I'm so sorry. Okay. Okay. Who knows? Can you talk more about incentives, Steve? How are they given out? When? What are they? And who pays for them? And I suspect you probably actually give some concrete examples, because there are a couple places we've been working with that have been doing this. So.
Yes. Great question. It's a big question. So I can give you a little bit of that. I think one important thing with incentives to think about is how to be proactive with that, which is to make that part of the case management approach right up front. So typically, even when we think about graduated responses, we think about a kid either does what you want them to or they don't, and then there's either a sanction or a reward. And I think it can be most effective if you build it into the case management right up front. When you're doing case planning, you're doing goal setting with young people and their families, and they know right up front, if you do X, Y, Z, here's what you can earn. And so I think in that way, it gives them something to shoot for right up front, and research backs that up, that young people are much more motivated by these types of rewards and incentives. Pierce County is one of our probation transformation sites, and also Deep Insight that's really done a great job with this in terms of putting it up front. Sorry, Tacoma, Washington. Thank you, Aaron. And so they've really done a great job with this in terms of putting the incentives up front and building an entire grid and structure around it. They have a program they call opportunity-based probation. And so young people that go through opportunity-based probation know up front. They know what their goals are in terms of responsibility goals, whether it's drug testing, curfew, whatever their probation conditions and rules are. They know up front what those are. They know what points they can earn for complying with those goals. And then they also have a grid that tells them, when you earn X number of points, here's what you can get. You can get a gift card, you can, a ticket to a movie, tickets to amusement park or some other type of community opportunities they've done. Pierce County's done a great job with their community partnerships and tapping into local providers to do yoga, boat building, skateboarding, bicycling, all sorts of activities that are meaningful to young people, keep them involved in healthy, constructive activities, and really using that as incentives.
Thank you. So we just have a few more minutes left, so I'm actually going to ask you if there are any sort of final thoughts or any sort of key things you want to leave folks with before we close.
Yeah, I think one thing is that this is just a real opportunity. Folks may say, and even when we talk about transforming probation and we talk about it being, flawed in concept and execution, that it seems a little maybe traumatic, and especially when you think about where the juvenile justice system is moving. And again, acknowledging successes in terms of we see secure detention numbers and overall out-of-home placement numbers going down. Why I think there's a sense of urgency, though, is because of all the knowledge that we have at our fingertips now, both about what works in addressing delinquent behavior and what we know about adolescent development. So it's a really opportune time because we're not working from a place of crisis. Very few places have overcrowding issues in their local detention facilities. Very few places have overcrowding with their state commitment facilities. So that's a good problem to have. But what it also creates is an opportunity for us to really modernize and really refine our system so that we're making sure that we're getting the very best outcomes for every young person who touches the system, both to make sure we push kids away from the system who shouldn't be pulled into the system so we don't do more harm than good, but also, again, when think about my days as a probation officer, those handful of kids that I just could not spend enough time with. And not because I wanted to surveil them and not because I wanted to find out if they're violating. I wish I could have worked more time because I knew that they needed role models, they needed mentors, they needed positive activities to be involved in. They needed people to both kind of have an arm around their shoulder and a foot behind them at the same time. And that's the experience of raising all teenagers. And I think this is an opportune time to modernize our system so that we can make sure that we're getting it right with every single young person who touches the system so that they all have an opportunity for successful, productive adulthood. They all have a brighter future.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. With that, we're coming to a close here. I just want to thank everybody again so much for joining us today and for your questions. And we're grateful to Steve for being here and to the foundation, of course, for giving us this opportunity in this space to talk about transforming probation, about creating that more modernized system that really puts young people on a path to success. And so, again, this is just the start of a conversation. Just an hour, obviously we can go deeper and talk more, and we definitely want to do that on the JDI Connect community. So please, as you are continuing to think about this, as you read the report, you take it in those bite-sized chunks that Steve talked about, and here it is again, Transforming Juvenile Probation, a vision for getting it right. Post your questions. Steve and other folks at Casey are standing at the ready to answer them and to point you to resources and to even connect you with one another because, as he said, there are already places that we've been working with that have been sort of moving in this direction and who have implemented some of the things that are recommended in the report. And so they can definitely share those experiences. This isn't the kind of thing where, no one's done it and we're just sort of making things up on the fly. So we've seen it work in places and definitely think it could be something that works in your jurisdiction too. So keep posting your questions, and we definitely want to work with you as we figure out how to work through the challenges of making this vision a reality. And you can also reach out to Steve directly on JDI Connect or via email, which is his email address is sbishop@aecf.org. And so as we said earlier, a recording of the town hall will be available and posted to JDI Connect later today. And then finally, we have a favor to ask of you. After the town hall closes, you'll be redirected to a brief survey. And so we're hoping you'll take a few minutes to complete it. We definitely want to know what you think about this session. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope that you found this to be a useful hour. Thank you again.
Thanks to everyone.